Welcome to this session of the Co-op Party Conference, and very warm welcome to the conference generally if you're not attending the whole event. This is our session on jobs, and never could that be more pertinent than now with all the issues around COVID-19 and the local lockdowns announced yesterday. And they need to be part of our plan for an economic recovery. But we, of course, want to see quality, not just quantity of jobs, higher wages, job security, and and people having a say and a stake in their workplace. And it's in Italy, and we're hoping to be joined by our Italian MEP colleague, that we can learn from Italy's Marcora law. And we want to explore as well how employee ownership can help and should be at the heart of a fairer economy. This is going to be a panel discussion, so I'm really delighted to welcome our panelists. Each panelist will speak for just over 5 minutes, and then I will try and facilitate a discussion. I should just warn that I am in Parliament and I might have a vote. So I'll introduce myself first of all. My name is Meg Hillier. I'm the MP for Hackney South and Shoreditch, and proud to be a Labour Co-op MP for the last 15 years. And our speakers today, I'll introduce the two we've got at the moment. We expect to be joined by the others. So we've got Deb Oxley, who's the Chief Executive of the Employee Ownership Association, which represents all organisations which are employee owned or transitioning to employee ownership. And Deb received an OBE in 2019 in recognition of her work in this area. And she's also a champion at the Cabinet Office in the Inclusive Economy Partnership and a board member for Scotland for employee ownership. And we also have with us Neil Smith, MBE. Neil is the Managing Director of Kinetic, which is an employee-owned company delivering recruitment and HR services. Kinetic transitioned to employee ownership in 2018, so fairly recently, in order to ensure that staff share in the business's success. And we are expected to be joined by Brando Benify MEP and James Kelly, but both are held up at the moment, I think on parliamentary business. So we're all double tasking here. As I say, I'm expecting a vote any moment. So if I have to slip out, I'll hand over to Anna Burley from the Co-op Party. So if I could, without further ado, I'm going to mute and hand over to Deb Oxley to kick off for us. Over to you, Deb.
Hi Meg, and hi everybody else. Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation here to the Co-operative Parties Conference. As Meg said, my name is Deb Oxley. I'm the Chief Executive of the membership organisation for employer businesses, the Employee Ownership Association. So we support businesses that are business owners and founders that are seeking to explore employee ownership and to decide whether or not it's the right solution for their business, and also businesses that are employee owned. We've got about 450 members of the employee ownership at the moment. The business has been around for 41 years, and we have a clear mission to try and grow both the size and the impact of the employee owned sector in the UK. And I'll come on to why we think that's an important mission to have a little bit later on. You've probably read about employee ownership. Most recently, there's been some high profile transitions. Richer Sounds, the hi-fi and electrical retailer, you'll have seen a big announcement in the press covered Julian Richer's transition of his business. And prior to that, businesses like Aardman Animations and Riverford Organics. But there are actually over 500 employee-owned businesses across the UK, which is a surprising fact that not a lot of people know. They tend to know the John Lewis Partnership, but after that they sort of lose track and can't name any others. And some of that's because the sector is actually made up of a lot of professional service companies. So there aren't that many retailers that you would necessarily be aware of that are employee owned, but there are lots and lots of professional service companies. And in fact, over 50% of the 500 businesses in the sector are in that professional services group. The second largest group are made up of retailers and wholesalers and manufacturers, and then we've got care providers as well. So the sector is quite diverse. All sizes of businesses, from the very largest businesses with tens of thousands of employees, right down to the very smallest with maybe 10 or 15 employees. And the sector has been growing at pace Ever since 2014, when the government introduced something called the Employee Ownership Trust model, which is a tax advantage mechanism for transferring ownership from an owner or a founder or a group of owners and founders into the hands of employees through a trust structure. And actually the biggest growth we've seen is in the last 3 years, where the sector has grown 50%. So that's not just been stimulated by the tax efficient way of doing that with the Employee Ownership Trust or the EOT, but also I think, and we have seen, because there has been a change of appetite amongst business owners to want to pass their businesses on at the point of succession to structures where they know that there's more confidence that those structures are going to be sustainable and resilient for the longer term. The evidence of why employee ownership is a positive force for good is very strong. Our latest evidence was published in 2018, and that was the ownership dividend. And this was a year-long study of the sector, gathering evidence from employer businesses, from their advisors, from accountants, lawyers and banks. And what the evidence clearly shows is that when everybody has a stake and a say in the business, as Meg described earlier, that it fundamentally changes the way employees feel about their level of responsibility and their level of discretional effort in the business. Collectively, that then impacts on the productivity and the financial performance of the business. And of course, if you are in a region where there are a number of these businesses, and we do have some clusters starting to develop across the UK, you then end up with these regions being far more resilient and more sustainable, and where, of course, they are sharing that wealth more widely across the employee base, which is then being reinvested in the local economy. So there's a whole raft of very positive reasons why more employee ownership in the economy would be a good thing, not just for the individual, not just for businesses, but also for the economy as a whole. And particularly, as Meg said in her introduction, we're facing into some serious challenges in the economy. We're looking at higher levels of inequality than we've ever seen before, real problems around resilience at a regional level and a business level. And obviously the issue of how to preserve more jobs as we face into this awful pandemic. So I think if you think about the title of this session, which is Jobs, 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 if we want, as Meg said, better jobs that are more sustainable, we actually need better businesses that are more sustainable. And hence, that's why I think employee ownership fits into that solution for the future. It's not right for every business, of course it's not, but for many businesses, particularly SMEs, family-owned businesses, and those strong regional businesses upon which this country depends, are prone to consider employee ownership, particularly at the point of succession. So I'm really excited by the opportunity to discuss more about that here today.
Thank you very much, Deb, for that. And I think it's quite, I hadn't actually realised that the sector's grown 50% over the last 3 years. And as you say, with all this talk about building back better, I think this must be part of the solution. And someone who can talk to us from the coalface, if you like, Neil Smith, has gone through this, is part of that growth with Kinetic over the last 3 years. So Neil, if you could unmute. And I'd also like to welcome James Kelly, MSP, who's now on the call, who's joining us from Glasgow. But if I turn to Neil now, over to you, Neil.
Okay, Meg, thanks very much. And thank you, Deb, for setting the scene. MD of Kinetic, what I'd probably like to do in my 5 minutes is just give a little bit of a case study about Kinetic, why employee ownership was the right thing for us as a business, and reflect the fact we're in transition and some of the things that have actually happened post the employee ownership in April 18. So Kinetic, very briefly, been around 25 years. And like lots of businesses over that period of time, the core biz in recruitment, we've been innovating all the time, new services, systems in the business. We diversified into payroll outsourcing as an example, where we started to expand some of our service offerings, and we've had a few startups within the recruitment, within the business of Kinetic. So the point about that is that all that value that was generated over those years and still is generated, it was all delivered by the people in the business. We haven't grown by acquisition, it's all been organic growth. Not that's a prerequisite for that, but essentially all that value and all that ongoing innovation is driven by the people in the business that have been there 5, 10, 15 years. My position very much, and it's not always about necessarily someone in thinking about successions. I hit the tender ages of late 50s, was to think about how I could protect that culture of this business. It's been around a long time, the great people that have been there and all the value they put in, and really looking for the right model that would satisfy what I wanted to happen, which was not to actually sell the business. And interestingly enough, this journey for me started about 4 years ago, trying to actually find out what was out there in the marketplace, apart from some of the traditional sale MBOs and the things that we're all quite familiar with. And that was a pretty tough gig, really, because there wasn't a lot of knowledge about the employee ownership model out there at all. We've often heard about the John Lewis model, but in terms of the offering for SMEs, but ultimately, by luck, a little bit on Google research, as much as joining EOA later and some helpful lawyers in Manchester, I came across the employee ownership model, and for what Kinetic at the time needed and the transition, it fitted perfectly for us as a company. And just to you know, the key reasons about that really were, as I say, it was all about the value driven by the people in the business. I wanted to protect the culture, people getting an understanding about where we're going as a company, as I perhaps got a little bit older as the main shareholder, where the company was going, and just keep that ethos and culture that we'd have all grown up with, like lots of family businesses or SMEs. And I don't think you have to be 25 years old to actually think about employee ownership. I know a number of companies are actually starting up businesses as employee owners. So mine was a bit of a history about recognizing how to protect our business culturally and independence, and give the people the business, which is what I've done. So all my shares have gone into a trust on behalf of the employees, and that happened in April 2018. So we are on a journey. I'm still there as the MD, championing employee ownership as today and with the EO board. And also that these things take a little bit of time. It's not just a one-off transaction and we're done. It's all part of a cultural learning as how people get ingrained in the business more, understand what we're about as a company, communicate more with each other across the different businesses that we've got, and all those good things you always want to do as an organisation, like any organisation want to do. But I truly believe that, you know, the employee ownership model just sets that infrastructure, that model, to be able to push on with some of those things. Why are we different? What's our differentiators? You know, they've got total buy-in to their organisation, so they can start thinking about some of the things that perhaps management worry about, when actually it's the people that really are going to give you the input. So that's a very potted, because I'm just conscious of time, and just where we are in this pandemic, without talking too much about the pandemic. Again, what we found, you know, the trust, the honesty, the security in the business, nobody feels particularly secure outside the business, I'm sure, but the work that's gone in post the employee ownership, more communication right across the business, much that we always communicated well anyway, are genuinely, and the mental health issues out there that we're hearing a lot more about, are generally feel in the business, not a metric, but the trust, the honesty and the security, and people knowing where we are as a business, what's going on, and the fact they're employee owners and it's their call, it's their decision on where we can go, has been absolutely enormous. So that's a very quick potty to try to keep the time, Meg. So
okay. Can I just ask before I move on, Neil, I'm just to warn James, I'm going to bring you in, James, a little ahead of schedule. But Neil, how long did it take you to transition from your old style to being an employee-owned company?
Yeah, well, I guess it took quite a long time to find out about the model, as I said before. Actually, when I found the model and was sure it would fit the culture of Kinetic, I met the lawyer just before Christmas in November of 17. This is where the actual sort of financial transaction, or the revenue approval and all that stuff around this, and the deal as such, the transfer of the shares into the trust on behalf of all the staff, it was all done by April 18. So the whole model, the whole transaction, for want of a better description, was 4 months.
So that's the technical transaction, but yeah. And when did you start talking to your staff about it, and how long was the run up?
The run up, I think probably on my management team, probably about 2 years prior, really to say, you know, I'm knocking on a little bit, with all respect. I've got a duty to look at succession planning. I don't want to sell the business. but I've got to find the right model, as I said earlier, that will fit the culture of the organisation. So my management team knew, and I've known them a long time, so they accepted that was my job to do. So it took quite a long time, Meg, to actually find the model. And then when it came to the conversations with the staff, to be honest, my management team were very well briefed on it all. And it was in a way, it was quite a simple process. I probably took quite a lot of time on a communication letter, for want of a better description, because we're 8 sites, to really explain why I was doing this. This was a new model for a capitalist model in lots of ways. It was about the ownership issue, and it was about driving on the strategy of the business and the fact they created the value. So that was all in the communication, if you like. And then really that was followed up with the road shows that we still do now remotely, clearly. Okay. And it's all about driving on the strategy of the business, where we're going, what we're good at, where we need to improve. And you're the employee owners now, the business, what are your thoughts and what are your questions about employee ownership? So.
Okay. Well, that's great. So that's just helpful, I think, to know in the context of what might happen post-COVID, if other companies think, how long does it take? And what's the capacity of people like Deb and others to advise, I guess. Well, anyway, I'm going to now turn with delight to James Kelly. James is an MSP for the Glasgow region. He's now a list member, having previously been a constituency MSP. And James is interested in cooperatives, but particularly chairs the cross-party group on the subject in Holyrood, covering credit unions, sport and consumer rights as well. So, and of course, the Scottish Labour Party is ahead of the game in many respects. It's committed to the Macora law for Scotland, the one that I was talking about earlier, the Italian law, in its manifesto. So there's hope there. Over to you, James.
Thank you, Megan. I'm absolutely delighted to join this online meeting. I think the overall theme of the conference, Own in the Future, is very much relevant for the times that we're in, and it's also a positive theme. Something that we need, something a bit more upbeat, to give people some hope and to offer a political solution going forward. I think this particular session underlines all that, emphasising jobs, because there's no doubt that the situation that we're in with the pandemic, not just ongoing, but the fallout there's going to be realistically, is going to have a devastating impact on their economy and in communities all over the United Kingdom. Where the Westminster constituency in which I reside, Rutherglen and Hamilton West, has the 4th highest uptake of the furlough scheme in Scotland out of the 59 constituencies. So that means there are a lot of workers, currently have been on furlough, and the reality is that as they emerge from furlough, some businesses are going to be under tremendous pressure. That will mean, realistically, that jobs will lose, or the configuration of those businesses will change, and people will face a prospect of an uncertain future. And I think it's against that backdrop that the employee ownership model is one that is very relevant for this time. I think in terms of looking at that model, it can be used to save some jobs, not just in this area, but throughout the United Kingdom. As an intervention that should be used as opposed to the traditional alternative profit model. I think in some ways the things are going to very much be reconfigured as a result of COVID, and the traditional view of a business operating, building up profits, distributing those profits to shareholders is something that, it wouldn't be obliterated, but I think it's something that we've got to try and change. And I think moving to a model where employees own the business has got tremendous advantages. First of all, from a financial point of view, if the profits are then shared and the employees are taking the decisions about channeling those profits either back into the business or to be shared amongst the employees, there's a much greater motivation for employees and also for local communities for using that model as opposed to the traditional profit model. And I think businesses have got a better opportunity to sustain if they are taking the profits back into the business themselves as opposed to redistributing them to shareholders, which frankly will take the finance not away from the business, but also away from the local communities where the businesses are based. So this, I think, is an idea for this time. I think the challenge for us as politicians is how do we then take that forward? And I think we've got to try and make the case more strongly for this model. It's great that we've got this event today, but we've got to try and take it out into the public forum. I think we need to be proactive where there are businesses that are under threat that are considering closing down altogether, in terms of promoting employee ownership as an opportunity. And I also think that fundamentally what we need to do is try and change the law to make the position of employee ownership a stronger and more robust one, as you said, Megan, in terms of advocating the Macora law, which has been trailblazed in Italy. In terms of what we're doing here in Scotland, as you mentioned, that is going to be something that we're going to be pushing. I'll be in the Scottish Labour manifesto for next year's Scottish Parliament election. So myself and other Scottish and Labour co-op candidates in that election will be arguing strongly for the Macora law and also for employee ownership linked to that to be a strong and relevant policy in that manifesto, and something that I'm sure that will resonate in communities throughout Scotland. So in summing up, I think the meeting today underlines the theme of the conference. I think it's very much relevant for the time. This is a time where employee ownership has come, and it can not only save many jobs in communities, save people's livelihoods, but also try and protect and reinvigorate these communities going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. And I'm really delighted to welcome Brando Benifi. Brando is one of the youngest members of the European Parliament, and a delight to have a member of the European Parliament, as we no longer have our homegrown MEPs, Brando. So a very warm welcome to you. And he represents the Partido Democrático in Brussels, and is very firmly behind the belief that a cooperative economy is a central part of the life of European citizens, and has an eclectic career supporting, among other things, youth and refugee employment, digitalisation, and the rights of people with disabilities. But I would also, as an Italian MEP, Brando, we'd be very keen to hear a bit more about Italy's Macora law and how that works in practice, and of course the challenges of getting a law like that passed through your parliament. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation, and thanks for your work in these years. I've been following, being associated with the, mainly with the Labour Party, but also participating in some events where you were also part of, and I know the importance of the Cooperative Party. In UK, your representation of very important interests of a fairer economy, of more inclusion in our society, and of an economic model that is fairer and with better role for all its parts and for the workers. So I'm very happy to be here, and I want also to say that with the cooperative movement in general, we have been working very well in these years in the European Parliament. Myself, now I'm the rapporteur for the European Social Fund in the Socialists and Democrats group, and we work very well and on this part of the European budget. Obviously, as you said, now it's something that is not related to your precise situation anymore, and to be frank, it's a very deep loss, the one that we faced by losing colleagues from UK that has been always at the forefront on the innovation of our social model at European level, and have been working very much on also on the topics that I will be touching now. I want to say that in this difficult year, when the entire world is facing the tragic COVID-19 pandemic crisis, I believe it is very crucial to discuss with you of how to rebuild the social pillars into economy. We are going to face when the crisis is gone, an economy that has to be more fair, that has to focus on the role of work and workers, in which the cooperatives can represent a sector with a solid economic profile, and also a model to be taken as an example. The employee ownership in particular is the main focus also of my contribution by taking into account and discussing about the Marcora law that you mentioned earlier, that was approved on February 27th in 1985, so 1 year before my birth. A law that wanted to support the world of cooperation, mainly in the field of access to credit. The Marcora law, though, is mainly remembered for its second part, which had the level of employment protection as its core scope. This legislative action was fought and built for company crisis situations, mainly depicting the possibility of rescuing companies through their employees united into cooperatives and giving them the tools to make it possible. In October of 1972, the fifth EEC's directive based on the German model was presented to the European Council, and in that same decade, many initiatives were born, such as the Balloch Committee in Great Britain and the Sudreau Commission in France. The self-management approach was arising in many contexts, fueling debate on workers' participation. The reasons that pushed Marcora in the end of the 70s to start thinking about enterprise recovery are to be found on two different layers. On the political one, it was the will to imagine an alternative model against the conflictual working class versus capital model on the economic one, and instead it was a need to respond to the economic crisis, oil crisis and post-Fordism labor reorganization as a second, we can say, aspect. Also to the employees that were ejected from the productive cycles. We can say there was also a third reason, which lays on the will to rationalize public spending on corporate restructuring, with the goal to find a productive way for to limit the cost of layoff schemes and investing so in economic networks that had a chance to stay in the market, to be able to stay in the market. So the reasons for these measures were summed up in the cover letter to the draft law presented by Marcora in May 1982. They were making the employees participate in the company's management, including the need to rethink the profits distribution, rationalizing the productive network of the small and medium-sized companies where the law on which the law insists, in order to save only the ones that are said to be able to recover. And third, recover the workers that are not actively employed anymore, bring them back to a production place in order to take them off a welfare system, not wasting their treasure of professional skills. So in the end, in Marcora's vision, the cooperation must not be a placeholder in the wait time for capitalism to get over a crisis, but the pillar of a shared and diffuse reorganization of the economic layers, following the principles of economy and employees' participation. Cooperazione Finanza Impresa, CFI, was born in 1986. It was participated and controlled by the Italian Ministry of Economic Development, and its role was to facilitate and support the cooperative companies of production and work and the social cooperatives. Invitalia, AGCI, mutualistic funds, Confcooperative, Lega Coop, so organizations of cooperatives in Italy, and 325 cooperative companies are also into this capital of this Cooperazione Finanza Impresa, which means entrepreneurship finance cooperation. It's a member of 3 main cooperative associations and also of the CECOPA, the European Confederation of Cooperatives and Worker-Owned Enterprises. It cooperates with Cooperfid Italia and with Soficatra, which is the financial institution of social economics in the European field. So this organization states its function of institutional investor participating in the share capital of the companies, aiming to protect and increment the occupation rates. It funds long-term investment plans and helps the workers in building an industrial plan and starting new companies. It controls the economic financial situation throughout all the duration of its participation. It checks the performances, helping to prevent potential risks. In these decades of activities, although dealing with very critical situations, CFI proved very clearly to be a useful piece of active work politics and a promoting mean of new entrepreneurship. The role played at a strong occupational feedback, and thanks to extra incomes coming from taxes and social security costs and from the social safety nets, it guaranteed a crucial economic return also for the state. Since its birth until for the date until December 31st, 2019, CFI supported 520 cooperatives, allowing to save and create over 22,000 jobs. The workers' buyout, which were made possible by the support of this Legge Marcora, predicts that workers invest their resources, starting from the unemployment benefit to the severance pay, so they can take responsibilities to manage the company, supported by CFI, and using the funds made available by the Marcora law, making a new bet on their own future. The regenerated companies showed up as a very valid tool to transform unemployment benefits into incentives to development, with a better survival rate than traditional ones. Nowadays, 65 cooperatives in Italy shows the workers' buyout way, for a total of 1,650 workers involved, and with a 80.41% of success rate for the company in time. So every experience of cooperative recovered through develops its own way. Some of them build their social capitals thanks to these severance pay and unemployment benefits of the workers, and thanks to the CFI's funding. Others instead are able to form their social capital by staying in the workplace and keeping working during the bankruptcy procedure of the company, or reconverting the production. So all these different experiences are overall a symbol of a battle that has been won. The battle of those who, together with other partners, defeated the isolation and frustration feelings that keep haunting those who remain workless in a society where a lot of respect and personal identity is linked also to being a worker. After such many periods of changes and after battles for those who reconverted the production, after seeing plants being completely emptied and in general workplaces. When promoting and adopting measures in favor of business transfers, the European Commission and member states should promote all types of these business transfers, including the business transfers to employees. Especially in the current situation, the EU can really ill afford to deny successful experiences of economic activities maintained on its territories and jobs being saved. Very often the problem encountered in business transfer to employees is the lack of knowledge about this business scenario among business owners, employees themselves, concerned professionals like lawyers, accountants, and even within the judicial system. Training for professionals would be essential then in promoting this practice, also at European level. Better knowledge about cooperatives should also be promoted in trade unions and among persons and structures whose mission is to provide information about the creation or transfer of businesses. Preferential rights should be given to employees in order to give them the best conditions for a takeover bid for an enterprise facing closure. Direct financial mechanisms aimed at helping employees investing in enterprises in crisis or without successor in order to engineer business transfers to employees, in particular under the cooperative form, should be strongly encouraged. And mechanisms such as unemployment benefits or any other type of benefits available for redundant workers should be made available for employees willing to use them as a capital for takeover bids for their enterprise facing closure. Workers owners of the newly established cooperatives should not shoulder the liabilities resulting from the failed company. training in cooperative management and governance for the future worker owners should also be promoted. So to conclude, as you see, we have a lot of challenges, and we have some important examples already in place, like the Marcora law I explained about, and also with the creation of the CFI structure, which I mentioned, the Cooperazione Finanza Impresa, and this important work between the state and the cooperative movement. I think it will be very important to continue working and discussing on these topics in this particular moment, where we are in the need to build a new economy. That what will come out of this pandemic crisis cannot be the word of before. We need to use this crisis also to face imbalances that were there already. And one of them is the need to have a stronger role for cooperatives, especially in this context we are talking about, because they can be a better economic endeavor, especially in this kind of crisis and reconversion situations. So thank you for asking me for this contribution, and I hope it was useful and interesting for your discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brando. We're going now to questions, and thank you for those of you who've been submitting them. What I'm going to suggest is at the end, and I'm just warning the panel now, I want to have everyone on the panel coming back to talk about how we can promote employee ownership as part of the solution for building back better. So you can think of a couple of steps that you'd like to see all of us individually, government, whoever, take to do that. So if you furnish that with examples. But I thought it'd be helpful just to cover off some of the, if you like, more practical issues about how employee ownership works. And thanks particularly to Bob and Derek, who highlight that it's tradition, a very big part of the co-op tradition to promote democracy. And so they're saying how in practice do employee ownership models ensure employees have a say in decision making. So I'm going to go to Deb and Neil on that question. So if I can go to Deb first, please.
Okay, good question. I think there's probably a couple of ways that you see it manifest itself in employer businesses. Quite often, these businesses do have employee representatives on the actual board of the business. Not always, but it's a natural sort of evolution for many of these businesses. Secondly, if they've got a trust structure, you will always see employee elected directors on the trust. And that's really important because, of course, the trust is in ownership of the shares and acting on behalf of the beneficiaries. So the employees are represented as trustee directors. And the third thing is you'll normally see an employee council or a forum, which is made up of a wider group of representatives. So in most employer businesses, you've got at least two of those, if not all three, voices and opportunities for representation. I think you're on mute, Meg.
Let me try to make sure there's no background noise. Neil, can we just turn to you now then on that, particularly because you've been going through it very recently. So how do you make sure it's democratic in your company?
Yeah, hitting the unmute button. Yes, I mean, very similar to Deb in terms of what the structure was set up. The trust board clearly manages the shares, and we're governed on that trust board by 22 very sensible rules around capital expenditure, where you're going in diversification, remuneration for directors. So there are measurements to make sure everything's being done on behalf of the employees, but also, of course, there's representation from the employees on that trust board. I mean, I would say as an SME, Kinetic, 63 staff, the value and the voice of the employees comes more from the employee council and just that general cultural engagement with them across the board. I mean, we're lucky in the fact that we're broadly Northwest England based. I can get around most of the sites on a regular basis. So it's perhaps a little bit more of an informal structure culturally for us. I guess if you're a multinational like someone like Arup, who are across lots of continents, so this can be done with multinationals, you've got a very different structure. So you've got to be clear on, when you go into this, what's the structure you think is going to work for your organisation. The employee council is great, it works well, but also we want to engage everybody in the company, and that's about communication to the people as much as formal boards really. So it's just getting that balance between, the trust board at the top, which is perhaps auditable, and a sort of like an audit as such, your employee council, which is great to get the voice, but also recognise, you're trying to get this across to everybody in the business. It's how as a company and how big you are, you're able to do that really. So
just to be clear, so the employee council is an informal body really to advise, for you to test the views, but it's not actually a democratic structure as such. It's that they don't have votes and elections directly. So,
I think what can happen, Meg, is it depends how the articles of the trust are constructed. So there is flexibility in the model. So dependent on the size of the business, the structure, what sector it's in, the articles of the trust allow the democratic voice, as you describe it, to be presented in different ways, dependent on the organisation. So there's not one model that fits all. It depends how big the organisation is.
Right, that's really helpful. And when I'm just thinking, playing into that, how we promote this and how we'll build back better. And a particular question for Neil. Thank you, Talia, or Thalia. Neil, Talia, I think it is. Has your productivity improved since you became an employee-owned company?
I think I have to unmute here. Can you hear me?
Oh, no, we can hear you. That's fine.
Oh, we're good. That's great. No unmuting. Productivity. Well, I guess there's some hard measures here, and it's not an easy one, is it, when we just wandered through a little bit of Brexit still, and we've had COVID to say our turnover's increased by 35%. Well, what I would say to you is, from a people point of view, the trust and the honesty and security after what's been happening has definitely helped people engage a lot more across all our segments of our businesses. And what that has done, in numbers terms, without sounding like an accountant, is, despite what's happening in our contract recruitment business, we're about the same as we were last year, which I think is quite remarkable in lots of ways. It's just a comparator. We've always been well run, but that is testament to everybody pulling from the 24-hour centre right the way through to the people coming into the offices when they are, key workers. So the commitment of everybody towards the cause of this, perhaps rather than not realising it's not my business, I'm not a shareholder, well, I'm not an owner, has been enormous. And I think without a doubt, I can't turn around to you and say the business has rocketed at 20% in this current climate, especially over the last 2 years, but it certainly set us up and set us against, if I look at the competition, enormously in terms of we're pretty much where we are, before any of this happened, and Brexit as well. So that's my sort of measure of success at the moment. Okay. Strong, resilient organisation.
Okay, I'm just going to turn now to Brando, if I may. Brando, we've got a question again from Talia about how difficult is it in the Italian example, is it to engage and organise employees? Obviously, you've had been doing this for some time. So, any particular lessons from Italy?
Well, I want to, I mean, at least for my experience, also talking with people that are actually experiencing this process, is that the lack of information, as I also mentioned earlier. There is the need for better understanding of the opportunities that are on place, thanks to laws like the one I explained, but also to the other possibilities that have been developed. And as I said, even professionals in the area that are advising are not very often able to really present the case for this as a good option for the workers themselves. So in my opinion, this would be the main obstacle still, the knowledge of the opportunities and having a system that can assist workers on in these dire situations.
Okay, thanks. We'll come back to that, I think, a bit at the end. But just before we go to the wider question, we've had a couple of questions from Martin and Councillor Pauline Bacon, about councils. How can councils support employee ownership in their area, or even with their own services and contracts? And from Councillor Bacon, in particular, if you're a public sector employee, how can they get involved? Could they do that via pension funds? So that's particularly to Deb, and if anyone else wants to come in, then please let me know. But to Deb Oxley.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Regional bodies like local authorities, LEPs, and all the other regional bodies that exist across the UK, I think have got a really important role around support. What we know, and Brandon mentioned this, is that awareness of employee ownership is quite poor still amongst both business owners and their advisors. So I think there's a role for local authorities in helping develop more awareness and being a point of reference or signposting inquirers into organisations like Co-ops UK or the EOA in terms of getting good advice about how to manage the transition. I think there's also another interesting similarity. Brando mentioned about finance. Access to finance for transitions to employee ownership is still not as universally available as it should be. The mainstream banks are getting there, but their structures don't lend themselves really to quickly learn from each other. So bits, you know, it's very sporadic, and there's a lack of consistency. It's interesting, of course, that, you know, local authority pension funds are vast. And is there an opportunity here for some legislation around encouraging or some opportunities and some incentives to encourage local authorities to invest in employer businesses within their region, which obviously is about supporting the local economy. So I think a really interesting question there, and definitely could do with some exploration. But I think the role of local bodies is pivotal in spreading awareness of employee ownership.
Okay, I've got one quite a particular question for James, from another James actually. This is, I'll read it out because I think it's clearly written. So Macora includes a payment for workers to help them acquire the target business and capitalise the new co-op, which is equivalent to a lump sum of would-be future unemployment benefits. So the question for you, maybe a bit technical for you, James, tell me if it is, but how can the Scottish Government do similar when employment benefit is not devolved? And can English cities do something similar? So yeah, is there a problem there with our, I mean, not going to get into the issue of devolution, James, but what are the technical challenges for you in Scotland, given that you've got Macora in the Labour manifesto for Scotland?
I think that's a fair point, because payment of unemployment benefit isn't a devolved issue, you know, so therefore you couldn't legislate in the Scottish Parliament to take the money from that source. I think the challenge from a Scottish Parliament perspective is to look at what are the other potential sources of income that would be available to employees to kind of future-proof the setting up of their company. So, I mean, in short, you couldn't do it the way it's been set out in the question in terms of the Scottish Parliament, but we would look to explore other mechanisms to do that. And I think that's going to be one of the really interesting aspects of the discussion we hope to promote in next year's Scottish Parliament elections. Right,
well, I'm moving on then to our final sort of discussion, really, and a chance for the panelists to come up with their thoughts about how we could really promote this. And I think you've led us in there well, James, because we've got an unprecedented time. I chair the Public Accounts Committee here in the UK Parliament, and we are seeing billions and billions of pounds spent. So there's going to be decades spent sorting out our economy. And so this is a real opportunity. I think a lot of us hope to see more of this type of employee ownership. So I'm going to ask the question, and the bell is ringing, so I'll have to go and vote. And that means I'll have to leave Anna to wind up. But how do we, just a couple of people have asked these questions, but I'm going to paraphrase them. How do we present employee ownership as a viable option to recover from this crisis? And what are the most persuasive arguments you can make to business owners to encourage them to transition? So what I'd really like from you is to kind of cover those questions, but if you could give a couple of things you think government could do and a couple of things that could be done to try and encourage businesses to take this up. So looking at it from both ends of the scale, that would really help. I'm going to go in reverse order, or Anna will now, because I'll have to go and vote. So I'm going to suggest that we start with Brando.
Yeah, I just want to say bye because I need to go for a committee meeting too.
Oh, you have to. Okay. Yeah. Have you got time to answer that or not?
Well, I think it's maybe more linked to your, if I understood the question, more linked.
Well, thank you, Brando. Okay, well, it is, yeah, we'll get hoping to learn more from you, but thank you for your time. I'm also having to go off and vote, so you're losing two of the politicians anyway. And I'm going to hand over now to Anna. And so I suggest we start with James, if that's okay, James, and then we'll go to Neil and then Deb. Okay, over to you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Meg, for joining us, and Brando as well. I appreciate it's a hugely busy time for everyone. James, it would be great to sort of get your input on those questions from Meg. Sort of what next? How do we take this forward? How do we make change happen?
Okay, thanks a lot, Anna, and I think it's been an excellent discussion. You know, some first-class contributions. So in terms of how we actually take this forward, I mean, I think Deb made a really good point when she highlighted the fact that employee ownership isn't all that well known as an actual model, so we've got to actually get it out there. So the reality going forward is we're going to be in a situation where there are going to be significant job losses, potentially businesses closing down, and that gives us the opportunity to present employee ownership as an alternative. So I think the challenge for all of us, whether it's politicians, trade unions, councils, you know, business owners, is to, when there are potential closures, is to actually step in there and say, have you thought about employee ownership as an option, and present the advantages of it. And I think one of the great things about this discussion is we heard some great detail about how to address some of the practical issues in terms of making the actual transfer from a traditional business owner model to an employee ownership model, how you would set that up. I don't think people generally are aware a lot of that. So there's the opportunity with the reality of job losses coming up to step in, to make the case, and to also offer practical advice. Second point I'd make is, when we've just been talking about, is where possible to try and back that up with appropriate legal changes which give employees support on the ground. We're in an advantage in Scotland in that we've got an election coming up next year, and we'll be able to promote this discussion and hopefully try in the short term in the Scottish Parliament to secure legal change that will not only promote employee ownership as a model, but actually have some legal backdrop that backs it up.
Great, and I guess sort of from that, the opposite perspective, Neil, sort of what would have helped make this easier? You mentioned about actually it took longer to stumble on the structure as it did to actually do the transition. So how can we better sort of promote and champion this and work with great champions like Deb to be able to bang the drum for employee ownership more loudly?
Good. Can you hear me? I don't have to unmute. Good.
You're there, yeah.
Just to pick up on sort of, you know, getting this across to business owners. I mean, what I hear all the time, and it is more of an awareness about this, is the fact that most business owners, not necessarily just SMEs, generally want to protect their culture and their independence and their ethos and look after their people. Why wouldn't you want to do that? So quite frankly, but they don't always aware this isn't necessarily the holy grail, but this is the model. The government, to some respect, has done its job from the tax incentive point of view, which isn't or shouldn't be the driver. So we're back on the awareness. Perhaps in the old days of regional development authorities, there might be a bit more economic clout. LEPs, perhaps a bit more teeth, as in local enterprise partnerships, really understand this. So, as you know, as Deb, I'm sure, has alluded to as well about the Employee Ownership Association and the growth. So, you know, we're on a roll. We just got to keep pushing it on. One slightly left field comment I'll make, because I was at my accountant's yesterday talking about employee ownership, funnily enough, and for some technical reason, accountants aren't allowed to be employee owned. So you wonder sometimes why they're not always the best informed or the best drivers of this model when actually they're told they can't do it. I'm sure it can be resolved by the Financial Conduct Authority, but I thought that was quite not amusing, quite a strange one, really. But, you know, it's out there. There's a lot of common sense. It's quite simplistic to put in. It is an awareness issue. And the local authority, public sector, stakeholder bodies just need to understand it a lot more. So over to Deb on that one, I guess.
Absolutely. I do think that's an interesting one about the accountants and the issue there. It is an issue that sort of co-ops report back to us a lot, is that diverse forms of ownership and ways of running businesses isn't always understood by the mainstream places you'd get advice from, be it solicitors, be it banking, be it accountants. So upskilling other professions to understand the sort of cooperative and worker-owned family is so important. Deb, over to you to sort of help us finish up for today. And I wonder if, in particular, you're a board member of Scotland for Employee Ownership, and I know that Cooperative Development Scotland do a lot of work around this transition to worker ownership, and wonder if perhaps you could touch on a little bit of what you think they're doing right there as well in your answer.
Well, I was going to reference learning from others actually as my summary. I think there's two places I would point to. You've mentioned Scotland, so the Industry Leadership Group, Scotland for Employee Ownership, and Cooperative Development Scotland, which is part of Scottish Enterprise, are both doing a tremendous job. And I think what we should learn from the devolved government there is that actually putting focused resource and attention into an area has impact, because the growth of employee ownership in Scotland is outstripping other parts of the UK. But I think we should also learn from the United States, and what you've got there is something that we've not talked about, which is cross-party support for this. I think I'm very conscious that employee ownership is neither about socialism or capitalism. It's about socialising capital, which is quite different. And therefore, it's not a topic that I think should be owned by either side of the sort of political divide. And I think to do that, is a really powerful thing. So, whether it's the Labour Party, championing this, but it needs cross-party support so that it doesn't fall out of favour with the change of administration, either at a regional level or a national level. And when you look at where we're coming out of where we are now, coming at the end of furlough, at the point at which early next year where businesses are going to have to start paying back debts, then I think there is also an opportunity for employee ownership to provide a solution. A debt for equity arrangement could be a very attractive solution for many businesses that will struggle to pay back the debts that they've incurred through bounce back loans and the CBILS scheme. The second question, which Meg left us with, which is how to incentivise, I think there's two elements I would say here. One is at a policy level. So Neil's mentioned the Employee Ownership Trust, the EOT model. Yes, that's an extremely positive and successful scheme. So we want that to continue. I'm sure there are other elements of policy development, and we've got a list, quite a lengthy list, as you might imagine, of tweaks that we would like to see to continue to incentivise business owners and their employees to look at the employee ownership solution. And I think at a regional level, going back to the awareness piece, this is still a minority sport as far as business structures are concerned, and therefore it needs a disproportionate amount of awareness raising, both in terms of helping business owners and their advisors understand it, but also really importantly explaining this to the sources of funding so that they can develop appropriate models to support these businesses.
Thank you. And comprehensive and a sort of a list as long as your arm of changes you want to see is certainly something we'd love to help you with, and we really value being able to work closely with yourselves at the EOA. And I think your point about sort of political consensus around different ways of doing business is really interesting. And in the context of hearing from Brando and the Italian example, is that in Italy, cooperativism is in the constitution, in part because there is sort of support from lots of different parts of the political spectrum that might not otherwise agree on other areas. So I think there is something about sort of that momentum that's created. Anyway, we have come up to 2 o'clock, so I won't keep you all any longer. So last thing for me is just to say a big thank you to Deb, to Neil, to James in their absence, to Meg and to Brando. It's been a really comprehensive and interesting discussion, and it's a sort of a policy area that I know we're very sort of passionate about pushing, particularly in the context of this crisis. We think that there's a real responsibility to look at the way that employee ownership can help to protect and improve jobs as we recover from COVID. So thank you massively, and we're back this evening for anyone who wants to dial in. The Youth Network is hosting a discussion on climate change with a youth activist, someone who set up a community energy company, and a councillor who's leading a lot of really positive climate action in their local city. So please dial in at 6:30, and a big thanks for joining. Bye everyone.